Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about one of the most interesting subjects, which is called world literature. Today with you is a teacher from Foreign Language Department of Bukhara State Pedagogical Institute. Today's our theme is the first four periods in English literature, its trends and well-known representatives. The theme consists of the following points. The first point is Introduction to English Literature, Timeline of the British Literary Periods. The second one is called Old English Period. The third one is Middle English Period. The fourth one is the Renaissance. And the last point is the Neoclassical Period. The history of English literature initiated with the history of the English race and kept on developing with the social development of the nation. When we analyze the history of English literature, we discover that it consists of 8 major periods and several ages. Each period or age of English literature is named after the central literary figure. The second, important rulers of England, and the third one, certain literary movements. We can see these features while naming the 8 major periods of English literature. For instance, the first period is called the Anglo-Saxon or Old English period, which started in 450 and lasted till 1066. The second period is called the Anglo-Norman or Middle English period, which began in 1066 and lasted till 15,000. The third period is called the Renaissance period, which started in 15,000 and lasted till 1660. The fourth period is called the Neoclassical period, which started in 1660 and lasted till 1798. The fifth period is called the Romantic period, which began in 1798 and lasted till 1837. The sixth period is called the Victorian period, which began in 1837 and lasted till 1901. The seventh period is called the Modern period, which began in 1901 and lasted till 1945. The last period is called the Contemporary period, which began in 1945 and lasts till today. So let's start with the first period of English literature, which is called Old English period. The Anglo-Saxon or Old English period is the first period in English literature which spans nearly 7 centuries. This period begins with the conquest of the Anglo-Saxon tribes in 450 and continues until the conquest of William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, in 1066. In order to investigate this era in depth, it is imperative to study the important historical events that happened in those centuries, because without looking at history, it is impossible to understand the essence of literary works created in that period. Thus, taking into consideration the development of historical events, it is appropriate to study the Old English period by dividing it into two ones. The first period is called pagan literature. Much of Old English poetry is of pagan origin and inspiration. They relate to pre-Christian age when the Anglo-Saxon forefathers lived in Germany. This is their native poetry which they brought into England as they conquered and settled here. Much of this poetry was unwritten and its authorship is unknown. The second period of Old English literature is called church literature. This type of literature was created when inhabitants of the British Isles were converted into Christianity. By the 5th century, the Germanic tribes were expanding into the Roman Empire as well as into Britain. The Angles, the Saxons, and Jutes turned their special attention to the British Isles. The Jutes landed in Kent somewhere in 450. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes were pagans, that is to say, they believed in many gods. The beautiful Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf may be called the foundation stone of all British poetry. It tells of times long before the Angles and Saxons came to Britain. There is no mention of England in it. The poem was composed around 700 by an unknown author. 300 years later, about the year 1000, the manuscript which still survives was written down by an unknown scribe. The poem presents the legendary history of the Anglo-Saxons, and its author might have been descended from the original tribes of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes who invaded Britain from the European continent in the 5th century. Those people spoke Germanic language in which the poem is written. Beowulf is 3,182 lines long, approximately 80 or 90 pages in book length. The narrative itself falls into two halves. The first part takes place in Denmark, where coming to the aid of King Hrothgar, Beowulf fights the monster Grendel and Grendel's mother. The second part is set in southern Sweden, where after the death of King Hygelac and his son Hadred, Beowulf has ruled in peace and prosperity for 50 years before being called upon to combat a dragon that is terrorizing the country after having its treasure hoard looted. Beowulf blends a fairy tale narrative with considerable historical material. At the end of the 6th century, monks came from Rome to Britain with the purpose to convert the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. So in the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxons were converted into Christianity. The part of England where the monks landed was Kent, and the first church they built was in the town of Canterbury. Up to this day, it is the English religious center. Latin words were introduced into the language of the Anglo-Saxons because the religious books that the Roman monks had brought to England were all written in Latin and Greek. So the poets were English, they had to write in Latin. Poets and writers of that period imitated Latin books about the early Christians and also made up stories of their own about saints. Religious poetry seems to have flourished in northern England, Northumbria, throughout the 8th century, so most of it has survived only in West Saxon transcriptions of the late 10th century. Monks produced not only manuscripts, masonry, sculpture, and missionaries, but also a lot of Christian poetry. Much of it consists of retelling of books and episodes from the Old Testament. The most outstanding representatives of church literature are Caedmon, Kinwulf, the Venerable Bede, Alfred the Great, and Asser. And here is given, in this slide, is given the literary works which were written by them. Here I want to mention that Kinwulf was one of the first English poets who introduced women characters to English literature with his works Juliana and Ellen. Venerable Bede, Alfred the Great made great contribution to the development of chronicles in English literature. So it is the end of the first point. The next period is called Middle English period. In the middle of the 11th century, the internal feuds among the Anglo-Saxon earls invited a foreign conquest. The Normans didn't miss their chance. In the year 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the Channel and defeated the English at Hastings in a great battle. Within 5 years, William the Conqueror became complete master of the whole of England. The lands of most of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy were given to the Norman barons, and they introduced their feudal laws to compel the peasants to work for them. The English became an oppressed nation. William the Conqueror couldn't speak a word in English. He and his barons spoke the Norman dialect of the French language, but the Anglo-Saxon dialects were not suppressed. During the following 200 years, communication went on in 3 languages. At the monasteries, learning went on in Latin. Norman French was the language of the ruling class and was king in court and official institutions, the common people held firmly to their mother tongue. In spite of this, however, the language changed so much in the course of time that we must speak about. Tales in verse and lyrical poems appeared praising the bravery and gallantry of noble knights, their heroic deeds, chivalrous attitude towards ladies. At first, they were all in Norman French. Many of the stories came from Old French sources, the language of which was a Romanic dialect, and for that reason, these works were called romances. A number of romances were based on Celtic legends, especially those about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. The heroes of these romances, unlike the characters of church literature, were human beings who loved, hated, and suffered. Their worship of fair ladies motivated the plots of the stories. King Arthur, a historical character and the national hero of the Celts, was described as an ideal feudal king with all the virtues of a hero. He possessed magical powers and was helped by Merlin, the cunning wizard. Arthur was honest and wise and fair to all his vassals, the knights. They had their meetings at a round table so that all should be equal. In the 15th century, Sir Thomas Malory collected the romances of King Arthur and arranged them in a series of stories in prose. They began with the birth of Arthur and how he became king, then related all the adventures of King Arthur and his noble knights, and ended in the death of these knights and of Arthur himself. The work was published in 1485 by Caxton, the first English printer at Westminster, under the title of Sir Thomas Malory's Book of King Arthur and of his noble knights of the Round Table. The book was more widely known as Morte d'Arthur. The epic in 21 books reflects the evolution of feudal society, its ideals, beliefs, and tragedies. In the death of Arthur, the author describes not only the end of a hero's life, the very title of the book implies that the epoch of knighthood, medieval chivalry, and feudalism has come to an end. The most outstanding representatives of Middle English period were William Langland, John Wycliffe, and Geoffrey Chaucer. Here I want to say that among them, Geoffrey Chaucer's contribution was great to the development of Middle English literature. His masterpiece, The Canterbury Tales, reflects all social classes which existed at that period. The next period is called Renaissance. Renaissance comes from the Latin word and means rebirth. The Renaissance was a fervent period of European culture, artistic, political, and economic rebirth. Following the Middle Ages, the Renaissance is credited with bridging the gap between the Middle Ages and the modern day civilization. The Renaissance or the revival of learning, which is another English term for it, was the period when European culture was at its height. English Renaissance began in 1485 and lasted till 1660. It is divided into two eras. The first era is called Tudor era, and the second one is called Jacobean era. During Renaissance, a great deal of writers, poets, and playwrights wrote a lot of their books and masterpieces. Among them are Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Thomas More, Edmund Spenser, Sir Philip Sidney, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and of course William Shakespeare. Each of these writers tried to depict the essence, the main events, the historical events of the period in their works, giving reflection and depiction of that period. So, and the last period is called Neoclassical period. Neoclassical literature was written between 1660 and 1798. This time period is broken down into three parts: the Restoration period, the Augustan period, the Age of Johnson. Writers of the Neoclassical period tried to imitate the style of the Romans and Greeks. Thus, the combination of the terms neo and which means new and classical, as in the day of the Roman and Greek classics. This was also the era of the Enlightenment, which emphasized logic and reason. It was preceded by the Renaissance and followed by the Romantic era. In fact, the neoclassical period ended in 1798 when Wordsworth published the Romantic lyrical ballads. The main representatives of neoclassical period are Alexander Pope, Daniel Defoe, and Jonathan Swift. Alexander Pope's contribution was great to neoclassical period as he translated books of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. Daniel Defoe and Jonathan Swift at that time created their masterpieces like Robinson Crusoe and Gulliver's Travels, which made them famous all around the world. So it was the end of our today's lecture. Thank you for your attention. See you soon. Bye.